Thank you very much. Thank you for the nice introduction and the invitation to be here today. My name is Lauren Ross. I'm a philosopher of science, and today I'm going to give a presentation on biology and its philosophy. This is a talk that is going to introduce philosophy of science, and it's also going to clarify how it relates to biology and to science more generally. So let's get started. Let's start things off by supposing that you are a scientist and someone asks you what you work on. You tell them that you study the genetic mechanisms that cause a particular disease phenotype. And let's suppose that this is a neurological disease. You study this in an animal model, and this is intended to give us some kind of information about human disease. After providing this description, you're asked a number of follow-up questions. The first question that you're asked is, in this case, in your work, how do you know that this gene causes this disease phenotype? This is as opposed to the gene being merely correlated with it. If you use a method to do this, how does it reliably distinguish genuine causal relationships from mere correlations? And how do you know that you can rely on it? A second question that you're asked is, how do you know that this is a disease phenotype as opposed to something that's just normal variation? There's often a significant amount of grant funding for traits that we consider to be diseases. And the reason for this, of course, is the practical value. We want to identify the causes of diseases so that we can target them for treatments and for preventions and cures. So if this phenotype is better thought of as normal variation, then we want to know this. So how is it that you make this determination? A third and final question that you're asked is, when you say that you're studying a mechanism here, what do you mean by this? How much causal and other types of detail do you need to include in your model to have a complete understanding of the mechanism that's relevant? Do you need to include all lower level causal details from molecular biology for this system? Do you need to include lower level causal and other details from chemistry or from physics? If you don't need to include these factors or these causes, why not, right? What's the justification for the causes that you include in your model and that you view as explaining this particular phenotype? These questions are theoretical and they're philosophical. They focus on scientific methodology and concepts and what it is that justifies them. When you practice science, you use methods and concepts, but you don't always have to argue for them. You don't always have to defend them. This is often because you're in a community where they are accepted. And in some cases, they've been accepted for a very long time. But there can be issues that come up, right? There isn't always perfect consensus. There are debates in some situations about which methods are better than others, about what it is that they do. And the same can happen with concepts, right? Debates about how to define particular scientific concepts. It's important to have answers to these questions in science so that we can settle these debates and so that we can have a clear understanding of the foundations of a particular scientific field. But these questions are pretty different from the more practical questions that scientists typically focus on. These are the types of questions that I focus on as a philosopher of science, and they make up a significant part of the field of philosophy of science, which is a field and a topic that we're going to discuss in more detail today. So with this initial scenario in mind, let me provide an overview of three main points that we're going to focus on in the talk today. In the very first part of this talk, we're going to answer the question, what is philosophy of science in general? What is this field? What does it focus on? In the second part of this talk, I'm going to give us some concrete examples of work in this space. This is going to be work that comes from two main areas. It's work on scientific explanation and causation. And in the third and final part of the talk, I will say something about why this work matters. I'm really going to address this all throughout the talk, but I'll highlight it again at the very end. So this is our basic plan. With this in mind, let's go ahead and get started with our very first question. So the very first question we have here is, what is philosophy of science? The quick and dirty and accurate answer to this question, in my view, is that philosophy of science is very similar to the theory of science. So if you know someone who's a theoretical biologist, their work is probably very similar to philosophy of biology. If you've ever heard of theoretical physics, or you know someone who works in this space, this is very similar to many questions that are addressed in the philosophy of physics. Part of what this shows is that there are many scientists, of course, who are engaged in work that is theory of science, and a lot of this work is very similar to, if not well understood as also, philosophy of science. So there's a number of great examples of scientists on the slide who do this kind of work. We have Ernst Mayr, Ken Kendler, and Eva Jablonka. It is probably more common to find scientists answering these types of questions when they're in a field that is changing a lot, where there are debates, turmoil, or where their work is at the kind of forefront of scientific discovery. A really nice example of this is Ken Kendler, who is a psychiatric geneticist. Psychiatry is a field where there's lots of debates. In my view, we can think of it as a field that is really at the forefront of medicine. There are huge, complicated questions about how to understand psychiatric diseases, how to define them, how to classify them, how to understand what their causes are. And so when you have a scientist in this kind of space, they're often more explicit about the theoretical questions that matter, and also what they take the best answers to be. So we find this in the work of Ken Kendler. He has incredible work on philosophy of psychiatry and the theory of medicine. So part of what I'm suggesting here is that many scientists do theory of science, and in some cases, they also do philosophy of science. Many philosophers also do philosophy of science, but they usually aren't scientists. So here are 3 examples of philosophers of science who've had a huge impact on the current field. This is James Woodward, Nancy Cartwright, and Helen Longino. Philosophers of science are typically focused on a particular scientific domain. This could be biology, physics, neuroscience, you name it. And they usually have some kind of significant background in the area, in that scientific field. This is becoming more and more common as philosophers specialize in my field. In fact, one common academic trajectory that they often have is they start in a scientific context. They work as scientists, they study science, and only after doing that for a bit do they migrate over to the field of philosophy of science. Maybe they realize they have theoretical interests. This happened to me in part. I studied medicine and got a medical degree before studying philosophy of science. And really, this makes sense. If you want to be a philosopher who says something, or many things, hopefully, that are insightful, that are helpful, that are accurate about the theory of science, you probably need to know a good amount of science. You need to know about that particular scientific space. Now, this isn't to say that one needs to study science before studying philosophy, but a philosopher of science better pick up this understanding along the way if they don't have it kind of beforehand. So while philosophers of science need training and a background in a particular scientific field, they also need to be well-versed in science more generally. So this is one important difference between philosophy of science and the more local focus that a scientist might have on a particular set of problems in a subfield of science. Philosophers are often interested in questions that are relevant to many different scientific fields. I'm going to talk today about causation and explanation. I work on these topics. I often focus on the biological sciences, but it's very easy and important to see similarities in how scientists causally reason and how they explain across many different scientific fields. This is something that is not only interesting, but it's also useful. If you see a similar puzzle showing up in physics and in biology, you can look at the solution that scientists in one domain provide to that puzzle, and you can see if that solution works in another space. So philosophers are trained to see these types of connections where scientists aren't necessarily looking for them. This is a kind of higher level perspective across many different scientific fields, looking for certain types of shared features of the methods across them, and it can be a very useful perspective to have. Another clarification that I should provide here is to say something about what is not philosophy of science. Philosophy of science is not merely science reporting, and it's not a mere description of what scientists do. So I'm going to talk today about causation and explanation. In my view, if a philosopher is doing work in these areas well, they appreciate scientific work, but their job isn't just to describe what scientists are doing, how they understand causation. Their job is to say something about how they should understand causation. Now, scientists often do understand causation in principled ways, but they don't always agree with each other, and they can't always all be right. So it can be helpful for a theoretician or a philosopher of science to settle some of these disagreements. Part of what we can see is that philosophy of science is often both descriptive and normative. You need to know what scientists are doing, but we also need to say something about why they're doing it, and sometimes settling debates when not everyone can be right. So philosophers of science are providing answers to theoretical questions. Part of what I've mentioned here and alluded to is that there is a continuity across these fields, the theory and philosophy of science and science. What's really behind this? Is anything really behind this? Philosophy and science share very strong and very important relations, and this is something that is often not appreciated. So I am a philosopher of science. If you are a scientist, we have the same origin and the same ancestors. We're also not in competition. We're often focused on different questions. Our interests and our heritage is more similar than you might think. Consider that humans have been interested in the natural world for a very long time. The people that we think of as some of the earliest scientists, they're also philosophers. So for example, the person that most people claim to be the first biologist of Western tradition is Aristotle. He's a biologist, but he's also a philosopher. We both claim him, right? And the reason for this is that his work falls into both camps, partly because the origins of a lot of philosophy are a study of the natural world. So this is alluding to and part of the shared origin of science and philosophy. And there's more here. If you pick someone that you think of as a scientist who did their work before 1830, during their lifetime, they were not referred to as a scientist. They were referred to as a natural philosopher. The term scientist is first used and coined in 1833. It's in fact coined by a Cambridge historian and philosopher, William Whewell. Before this time, the individuals that we think of as scientists, they're called natural philosophers. This is true for Newton, Galileo, Darwin, and so on. Now, unfortunately, not all modern philosophy has an appreciation for science and the natural world. Mine does, but this isn't a universal view across, all philosophers. In my view, if philosophers want to say something about the natural world, or if they want to answer questions about it, they need to appreciate science and know something about it, because science gives us our best understanding of the world. But this isn't something that I can just assume in the work that I do. I have to show that this is the case. So this involves revealing and showing and arguing for the rationale behind the methods of science. So this is a nice introduction to the second main part of this talk, which is a focus on some concrete examples of philosophy of science. And a caveat here is that there are many different types of philosophy of science. The types that I'm going to discuss today, they're often methodological in their orientation. They are focused on the methods, assumptions, and concepts of science and what their justification is. We can think of this generically as the scientific method, why it works, why it's better than a non-scientific approach, or in some cases, why one method is better than another, given certain goals that we have in a scientific context. When philosophers think of the work that scientists do, they view them as engaged in different types of projects. Consider 4 of these projects. A first thing that scientists can be engaged in is they can provide descriptions. They can describe features of things in the world. They can describe features of an animal cell, like the different organelles. They can describe features of plants, the shape of its leaves or its flowers, the color of the leaves and the flowers. A second project that scientists are engaged in is they provide classifications. They can use these features to sort objects into categories where these classifications are useful. So they classify plants, they classify microorganisms, and they classify diseases. A third project that scientists are engaged in is they make predictions. This, of course, is very useful. They're predicting the likelihood of some future event occurring. They can predict when a storm will occur, how a disease will be transmitted through a population, and in fact, the likelihood of an individual getting a disease or not. A fourth project that scientists are engaged in is they provide explanations. We think of explanations as answers to why questions. In this case, they aren't just describing the features of the plant. They're explaining why the plant has those features. They're not just predicting when a storm is going to happen. They're explaining why the storm is going to happen or why it did happen. Philosophers and scientists do not view all of these projects as created equal. They require different types of information, and some of them are a lot easier or harder than others. A common claim in philosophy is that a main goal of science, and maybe the heart of science, is to provide explanations. Unlike these 3 other projects, explanation is viewed as providing some kind of deep knowledge and deep understanding about the world. So the famous philosopher Carl Hempel stated that to explain the phenomena of the physical world is one of the primary objectives of the natural sciences. Because of the importance of explanation, philosophers of science are interested in clarifying what exactly scientific explanations are. We want to know, what do they look like? How do we know when we have a good explanation versus a bad one? How do we know when there is an attempt to provide an explanation, but that really doesn't explain at all? Are there different types of scientific explanation that we find in different scientific contexts? If explanation really is the primary objective of the natural sciences, the heart of science, we should be able to say how they work. We should be able to say what their features are, how it is that we can identify them, and how scientists are providing them. So here we have the topic of explanation, a huge topic, a huge focus of a lot of work in philosophy of science. One way to think of scientific explanation is with a basic model that involves 3 main parts. The first part of a scientific explanation is the explanatory target. You can't provide an explanation of something until you specify what that something is. The fancy word that philosophers have for the explanatory target is explanandum. And we often think of the explanatory target as couched in a why question. So it's when we kind of phrase these questions, we want to know, why is this something that took place as opposed to something else? There's always a contrastive focus in the explanatory target. It doesn't need to be binary, it can be continuous, but there's always a question that involves a contrast where you want to know why this as opposed to something else. So here are examples of explanatory targets in science. Why is it the case that the fruit fly has brown eyes as opposed to white eyes? Why do genetically identical plants in different locations all reach different heights in the same amount of time? Why is it the case that in my study on this neurological disease, some of the mice exhibit this disease, but others don't? So these are all questions that capture our explanatory target. The second piece of a scientific explanation is the thing that does the explanatory work. So in the case of the fruit flies, we might think that a gene is explaining this difference in eye color. In the case of differences in plant height, we might think that there are environmental conditions that explain this, differences in temperature, water, fertilizer. In the case of the neurological disease in the mouse, we might think that this is due to molecular level factors, differences in these across mice getting the disease and mice that don't have it. The fancy word that we have for the thing that does the explanatory work is the explanans. And the third part of explanation is captured with the blue arrow here. And this represents the dependency relation between the explanatory target and the thing that does the explanatory work. In these cases, that dependency relation is causal. So in all of these cases, the thing that's doing the explanatory work is something that we think of as causing the outcome that it explains. So part of what you can start to see here is that causation is creeping into the picture. This is because we think that causation is important to many explanations in science. Not all of them, as I'll mention later, but many of them, perhaps most of them. This is because we think causes explain their effects. And when we ask an explanatory why question, we're often asking for the main cause or the causal process that produces that thing that we're interested in. Part of what you can start to see here is how this kind of work, how this kind of project is very different from the other three that I mentioned earlier, providing a description, a classification, or prediction. We can do all of those three things without causal information. You can describe surface level features of different objects in the world, organisms, without knowing anything about what causes those features. And you can classify on the basis of them. We can make predictions with information about mere correlation. We don't need causation for that. So one main point here is that many scientific explanations are causal. They involve and they rely on causal information. So here we have a second main topic and focus of interest in the philosophical literature. In fact, causation is of interest in many different literatures and fields of study. Causation is of interest not just in philosophy, but also in science, in the law, and in everyday life, right? We want to know about causation in our everyday lives. Why is there all of this interest in causation? Well, we already know a first reason. It was just mentioned, explanation. We are interested in getting information about causal relationships in the world because we want to explain things. If there is a car crash on the street, we want to know what explains why that crash happened. Was there ice on the road? Was there some problem with the mechanics of the car? Was the driver not paying attention? We want to know what explained that particular crash. And of course, we want to have explanations in scientific and legal contexts as well. But there are other reasons for why we're interested in causation. The second reason has to do with control. So we don't just want to sit back and explain things in the world with fancy words, even if we're doing it accurately. We want to do something about it. We want to get control over the world, and we often want to prevent these outcomes, or if they occur, we want to undo them. So obvious examples of this come from medicine. We don't just want to explain diseases. We want to control them. We want to treat them, prevent them, and cure them. Causal information is invaluable for this goal because causal information is information about control. We typically think that causes control their effects. So when you identify a causal relationship, you're automatically getting some information about how to control something in the world. So control is a second main reason for our interest in causation. There's a third reason, and this is that causation helps us with the attribution of responsibility and blame. Part of what we find is that, especially in legal contexts, we're interested in causation because we want to know who or what is at fault. So in the case of that car crash, we want to know what the causes of the crash are because we want to know who's responsible for it. In the context of medicine, if a patient is exhibiting a particular behavior and we think that it's due to their disease pathology, we don't hold them responsible for it, right? That we don't think they have control. We attribute it to the disease that they have. So causation matters to us also because we use it in determining what is to blame or what is responsible for different outcomes. We can start to phrase our interest in these topics in terms of our scientific examples. So in our scientific examples, we're looking at cases where we want to know what causes this neurological disease, what causes the eye color in the fruit flies, what causes plant height. One of the challenges that we encounter when we attempt to answer these questions is that there appear to be tons of factors that could be causally relevant to the outcome. And we don't think they're all explanatory. And even if we did, we couldn't include them all in our model. But we think some of them matter more than others. Here are a couple questions to help kind of motivate this. When you identify the causes that explain these outcomes, these scientific targets, do you need to include all lower level causes from chemistry and from physics? Do you need to include all past history causes, like the Big Bang? Is the Big Bang a kind of cause or an explanation for everything? If not, why not? What's the justification for the causes that you cite in your model and that you elevate as the main causes of the outcome and the real explanation? So philosophers are providing answers. They do provide answers to these questions. So let's take a look at how philosophers of science have answered these questions, which are essentially focused on how do you identify the causes that matter the most for explaining different types of outcomes in science. A first thing that we need to do this is we need an account of causation. The account that many philosophers of science use that is scientifically informed is provided by James Woodward. This is an account of causation in terms of intervention and control, sometimes called the interventionist account of causation. This is a very influential account. He discusses it in his book, Making Things Happen, and many other publications. Many other philosophers of science discuss it too. They rely on it. So Janan Ishmael, a philosopher, has referred to this as the most important book on causation in decades. Alison Gopnik refers to Jim Woodward as having revolutionized causation in my field. So this is a very influential account of causation. What does this account say? How do we understand causation with this framework? Well, suppose you have a candidate cause X and you have some effect that you think it produces. On this account, what it means to say that X is a cause of Y is something that you can understand kind of in terms of a scientific experiment. What it means is that if you were to intervene on X and change its values, wiggle it, that when you do this, you get control over and you change the values of Y, very similar to an experiment. So causes are factors such that when you intervene on them in the right kind of way, they give you control over their effects. This is an understanding of causation that very much connects it up to control. Causes give control over their effects. That is the account in a nutshell in like 3 sentences. There is a lot more to discuss here. This is a very long book and there's lots of work on this, but that's the way that we can understand it for this kind of framework that we're discussing. What else do we need to understand what causes are relevant to scientific explanations? A second thing that we need, and a second thing that's helpful, is really being clear about what the explanatory target is. This is going to help us exclude irrelevant causes because a lot of them don't give us control over the target. And that's a basic feature that a real causal factor has to meet. So part of what we can see is that specifying the explanatory target allows us to exclude things like the Big Bang and lots of lower details from physics and from chemistry on the basis of the fact that if you considered interventions on these factors, they are not going to control the explanatory target that you're interested in. If you considered the disease phenotype in the mouse model, neurological disease present or absent, that's our explanatory target, and you think of the Big Bang, right? If you changed whether the Big Bang happened or not, that's not going to give you control over that disease phenotype. That controls whether there's mice at all on the planet or whether we're here at all. But that's not the thing we want to explain. The thing we want to explain is this very fine-grained, precise explanatory target. So part of what this shows is that the factors that are viewed as causally relevant to this outcome need to give us some kind of control over this precise target. Once this is appreciated, we can start to remove lots of causal factors from consideration, right? This explains, why don't scientists cite all of these things in their explanations? Well, this partly explains why. And we can think about this with respect to lower level causes in physics. So what's the cause of COVID? Well, the dominant scientific explanation is that it's caused by a virus. Are there lower level causes in physics that provide a better explanation or that need to be included in a complete explanation? Well, quarks don't give us control over COVID. A virus does. So a virus is a better explanation for this explanatory outcome. One way that I sometimes phrase this is that with respect to determining what causes matter the most, it's not about how low can you go, but what gives you control. That's one of the main driving motivations behind finding relevant, explanatorily relevant factors. So we aren't yet finished. Even when we employ 1 and 2, there's still lots of things that appear to be causally relevant to the target, but that we don't cite in our explanations. We don't think that they matter. How do we further isolate the main causes of the explanatory outcome? One way that we can think of this is that there are differences in or across causes. So if you look at that blue arrow, that represents a causal relationship, but there's many different types of causal relationships. There's many different types of causes. Some causes are fast, others are slow. Some are stable, some are unstable or sensitive. Some of them produce effects that are reversible and others produce effects that are irreversible. So the light switch on the wall is a reversible cause of the light in the room. I can intervene on the cause and I can change the effect on and off over and over. But if I threw a brick through a window, that's an irreversible causal relationship. There's no way to re-intervene on the cause to undo what's happened. There are many distinctions among types of causes and types of causal influence. Part of why appreciating this matters is that we think that different types of causal influence are more useful and more relevant in our explanations. One nice example of this is stable causes or stability. Stable causes are factors that exert their causal influence across a wide variety of background conditions. So if we identify a gene that only causes eye color in the fruit flies in a very particular lab, in a very narrow temperature range, in a particular location, we will view that factor as less explanatory than another factor that exerts its causal influence across a wider range of changes in those background conditions. So this starts to give us some answers for the rationale behind including and excluding factors in our causal explanations. And this really just scratches the surface. There is a lot more to say about this. And this is recent work in philosophy of science. Most philosophy that's focused on causation has focused on how to define causation, different accounts. This is work that captures differences across types of causal relationships. In my view, this is really important for making sure that we appreciate how scientists are explaining, because the explanations and the causal systems they appeal to are pretty complicated and they differ. There's lots of different kinds. So one way to see this is notice that the model I have here of causation and explanation, it's incredibly simple. This is a one cause, one effect relationship. Find examples of this in science, they're not that common. Usually scientists are citing many causal factors in their explanations, and there's complicated ways that they interrelate to produce their outcomes. So how do we start to capture some of this to better understand or to have a more realistic account of scientific explanation? Well, one way we can do this is by appreciating basically different types of causal things in the world or distinctions among causation. So one set of distinctions takes place at the level of a single causal step. And this is what I just mentioned, right? There's different types of causal influence, different types of causes. They can differ with respect to their speed, stability, whether they're reversible or irreversible, and the list goes on. There are other distinctions we can make with more complex causal scenarios. So another set of distinctions have to do with differences in how causal steps are organized. This is a kind of simple causal structure. So we can have linear causation, like domino causality, where you have a linear chain. We can also have branching organizations. I have a final common pathway here up on the slide. In this case, the causes are converging. Causes can also diverge, or you can have a cycle. You can have a positive feedback loop. These are just different types of causal structures. Capturing these differences matter because these different structures exhibit different types of behaviors, right? They figure in different types of explanations. There is another dimension along which we can capture differences across more complicated causal systems. And one way to look for these is to appreciate the causal language that scientists use when they refer to more complicated causal structures and causal systems. We see this when scientists appeal to causal systems they refer to as mechanisms or pathways or cascades. These are built out of the kind of earlier causal distinctions, but they're a lot more complicated. They involve other features. So examples of causal mechanisms are immense in science. There are many different examples there are many different cases where scientists are using this causal term. We have mechanisms of gene expression. We have reaction mechanisms in chemistry. We have enzymes that are referred to as, the smallest like machines or molecular motors in biology in some cases. The way that philosophers think of mechanisms is that they're fairly machine-like. So a mechanism is understood as something that has lower level parts where the parts interact to produce a particular behavior. The mechanism is relative to a particular behavior that it produces. And they're sometimes analogized to machines like engines, or a watch mechanism has a kind of similar set of features. Now, mechanism isn't the only causal concept or term that scientists use, and it isn't the only type of causal structure that we find in science. Scientists also refer to pathways. There are many great examples of pathways in many different sciences. We have developmental pathways, gene expression pathways, metabolic pathways, ecological pathways in ecology, food chains, vascular pathways like a blood vessel. These causal systems can differ from mechanisms in a number of ways. First, they often involve the flow of something along the steps. And second, they often abstract from lots of detail. This is because they can be relevant to many different situations where the lower level mechanisms are different. Also, here we have an analogy to roadways, highways, and city streets. And the analogy runs deep. Scientists represent pathways with what they call roadmaps of metabolic pathways. If you look at these roadmaps, they're quite different from thinking of a causal system as a machine. They're not giving you information about parts that interact to produce a single thing. This is a set of routes, a set of connections, right? Depending on where you start, you can get to many different locations. Yet another causal concept that we find in science is the notion of a cascade. Cascades are found in biology. We have the blood coagulation cascade, cell signaling cascades. We have trophic cascades in ecology. We have cascades in epidemiology, the R0, disease transmissibility, and in physics and in chemistry, nuclear fission, cascading reactions. Part of what I mentioned earlier is that philosophers of science are looking at things that are shared across many different scientific fields. Look at this causal structure that's present across many different scientific domains. The notion of a cascade, or cascade as a causal structure, is typically something that has a small trigger that produces an explosive effect that can amplify. We see this in all of these cases. So a nice example of the kind of perspective of a philosopher of science of seeing a kind of shared, in this case, a shared causal structure. You have a shared causal structure, guess what? There's similar types of reasoning that take place with the same causal system. Just one thing to note here before I conclude, I discussed causal explanation in detail. We also think that there are other explanations that are non-causal. They're often also called mathematical explanations. There are great examples from biology here in this space. So some of these explanations are optimality explanations, explaining why sunflower seeds are packed in a Fibonacci sequence on the sunflower head, why bees have hexagonal shaped honeycombs. And in other cases, the explanations are topological. You can appeal to topological properties or mathematical properties of a system to explain some of its behaviors. An important thing to note, it's not that math is being used to represent these systems. You can represent causation with math. It's that math is doing the explanatory work and that causal information is not. This is recent work in philosophy of science. Over the better part of the last 40 years, we've focused mainly on causal explanation, but there's been more attention to explanations that are non-causal and mathematical. In conclusion, why does this matter? I mentioned earlier that when you practice science, you use methods and concepts, but you don't always have to argue for them, right? You're in a community where they can be accepted. Sometimes issues come up, right? There isn't always perfect consensus. In these cases, we want to settle these debates. We want to identify causes and provide explanations, and we want to do it in the right way, a way that's rigorous and a way that's principled. It's important to have answers to these questions in scientific domains in order to settle these debates and to have a clear understanding of the foundations of a scientific field. But it's also important to have answers to these questions outside of science. We need to be able to defend science and to provide a justification for its methods, and also to facilitate science communication. Being able to clearly communicate why science is so successful in giving us our best understanding of the world is incredibly important. We're realizing how important this is more and more with misinformation and a lack of trust in science. These conversations can be difficult to have, but they're important. All of these projects require knowing, and in some cases, providing the justification or the rationale for the methods of science. This can be done successfully with an appreciation for science and also for its theory and for its philosophy. Thank you.